When the white Christian Protestant male walks into this country, the European walks into this country, he is asking, where is your book? Shastra is not a scripture, it is a knowledge tradition. There is a difference between a scripture and a knowledge tradition. So what these people do around 1770s is they undertake the codification of Hindu law, and it's called Ordinance of Pandits, Anglo-Hindu law. So what we know today as codification of Hindu law or Shastric principles is actually British codification through their understanding of our scripture. So this is one track called as the Hindu track. Then comes the Muslim track. 92% Muslim was following Hindu law. There was no imposition. That's because that is the law they had inherited from their ancestors, period, nothing else. The only way to create a pan-Muslim identity across the country so that the two-nation theory and specifically the Muslim League gets greater traction is by severing the relationship between the cultural past and the religious present. And to do so, you have to Shariatize Indian cultural values. The British man then finally realizes, why don't I codify Muslim law? British Indian Muslim jurisprudence starts changing. The zeal of reform. Reform. The word used was Hindu law or Hindu customs and the Hindu society represented a slum which needed clearance. Language used by some framers of the constitution. So the entire legislative assembly or the majority of them and members of the cabinet under Nehru were opposing him tooth and nail on the subject. Then the Hindu Mahasabha said, why do you want to only codify and reform Hindus? Let's start a uniform civil code. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru realizes, I can't push this whole thing lock, stock and barrel. I will have to give it in doses and I'll have to tone it down significantly. Uniform Civil Code has been pushed into DPSC. Individual rights and dignity will stop here. No, you can't go here. Constitutional morality will come here and stop here. Then all rights of women, gender equality will come and stop here. Because this space is occupied by secularism. That's the void. That's the Bermuda Triangle where everything vanishes. It is the black hole where everything goes down and nothing comes out. When we discuss the question of Uniform Civil Code, how many law students do we have here? Fantastic. In legal research, one of the things that is expected of you to understand and distill is not the question itself, but the question in its most fundamental form and various manifestations of that fundamental question. You have to unpack the layers and ask yourself, what are the different ramifications of a particular issue that is being framed? You try and answer the question from a panoramic perspective, from a 360-degree perspective. An issue such as the Uniform Civil Code, let me first talk about the issue before I get into the issue itself, is obviously extremely emotive, and it is not particular to any particular community. For the simple reason that one of my fundamental disagreements with everyone who has taken a position either pro or against UCC, or specifically those who have taken a position pro UCC, is that they start with an assumption that personal laws are man-made laws, whereas the belief of the believer is that personal laws are also, or they have flown or they've been established by the divine. That's the position. You can choose to reject that particular position from a position of rationality, but personal laws in every faith differ because the source is either a revelation or a scripture, whichever way you see it. Now, it's easy to say, so what? Well, because it relates to religion, and this is Bharat. This is not France of the 1780s, and this is certainly not France of the 2000s or the 2020s. We were and we will continue to be a deeply religious society regardless of whichever religion you may subscribe to. That will not change. So I think it's extremely important to take this into account. Now there are two ways of approaching this particular issue. One, bulldoze that sentiment and say it doesn't make a difference at all. Usually, particularly in Bharat, when a law does not meet popular acceptance, it will never find practical application on the ground. There will be silent resistance, and it will be extremely difficult for you to enforce it. Considering the nature of the subject, This is an issue that requires consultation. I am not saying consensus building because it is not possible to build consensus on this subject. Neither within one community nor among different communities, that's not going to be possible. But merely because it is difficult to build a consensus, or dare I say, or even impossible to build a consensus, that does not take away the duty of the state to consult, to seek, and to engage. That is the basic expectation. Now, to consult, to seek, and to engage, again, is not the same as pampering all rabid radical sentiments. That is where the red line has to be drawn. Now, therefore, it falls upon the state to ask itself the first few questions. Why UCC? What will it look like? How will it be implemented? What are the concessions that are going to be expected from various communities and various members of different sects? It's an extremely nuanced conversation. This is not like Article 370. This is not like CAA. This has a greater implication because these are positions that communities have held dear for millennia, or at the very least hundreds of years. Does this mean that the tone of my conversation is moving towards an anti-UCC position? No, it's not. Does it mean that I'm moving towards a pro-UCC position? I genuinely don't know, because I need certain answers. I need certain questions to be answered. So I'm hoping to present those questions. The answers to each of those questions will differ for members of different communities. It will not be the same. And if you choose to have a conversation on the Uniform Civil Code without actually having a conversation on the history of codification of personal laws in this country, it is a truncated, moth-eaten discussion which is absolutely ahistoric and which has no basis in facts or history. So it is extremely crucial for you to understand the history of codification of religious laws in this country. When you speak of a Shariat Act, or when you speak of, let's say, the Hindu Code, or the position prior to the Hindu Code, by way of codification of Hindu laws by the British establishment, how did it happen? These questions are extremely crucial. Unfortunately, public discourse does not have either the patience or the bandwidth for these kinds of nuanced conversations. Considering that we have a majority of law students here in the audience, the hope is that your patience levels are better, that your ability to ask sharper questions is better, and your ability to arrive at conclusions, even if they are at loggerheads with your preconceived notions, is better. So kindly keep an open mind in this conversation. For a moment, keep binary, let's say, a binary approach on the side, park it on the side, and just pay attention to some of these factoids that I'm going to present. I'm going to cover a lot of history in a short period of time, therefore, obviously, quite a few milestones will be missed. But the hope is that I'm going to cover as many factual data points as possible, which will give you a broad picture. And from there, you can take it forward if you're still interested in the topic. First, if the premise is that personal laws have a scriptural or a religious basis, from there you have to make a jump to a uniform civil code. Now, the language that is used or that is proposed to be used is a uniform civil code. It doesn't say secular civil code. So what is the consequence then? If it moves from a religious position to a uniform position, the question that people are bound to ask is uniformity based on what? What will be the basic, let's say, substratum or datum on the basis of which you will determine or define uniformity, and how do you expect everybody else to follow suit? That is one level of the argument where uniform civil code can still be religious because the word that is being used is uniform and not secular. I will have to focus only on the language of the acronym because I don't have a document in front of me still. We don't have a draft. So I'm going to ask some of these fundamental questions even if they look stupid for a moment. Now, if you say if a uniform civil code actually translates to a secular civil code, You're asking people to make the jump from religious laws to directly secular laws. And that is a huge portion or huge aspect of their cultural worldview. That's a huge aspect of their outlook with respect to interpersonal relations, with respect to marriage, the notions of marriage, with respect to notions of succession, with respect to positions of a man and a woman in a family or in a setup. Each of these questions are deeply tied to the aspect of faith. It's impossible to actually sever it. We assume that this is only limited to two major religions in this country. But even within each of these major religions, there are multiple questions. Not all of them have uniform practices across the board. In order for you to get people on board for such a sensitive topic, unless and until you explain to them what is the tangible benefit that is going to be accrued from it, it's going to be extremely difficult to convince even 50% of the population. I am not convinced yet myself. So those who did not want me to speak today should ask themselves what kind of preconceived notions did they harbor in the first place. They've made up their minds about my position. My position itself has seen a drastic fluctuation. And dare I say it is still in a state of flux, which means I'm still forming an opinion. I'm still reading. What happens in the colonial period? Let me just take about 15 minutes each for each faith system, at least the two major religions, before I come to the question of what happened in the Constituent Assembly on the question of the Uniform Civil Code. See, when the British man set foot in this country, as I have said before and I have written before, he was carrying the baggage of the Protestant Reformation. Because the entire colonization experience is the product of, or at least a partial consequence of, the Protestant Reformation. I've established this to the best of my abilities in my first book, and I'm very clear about this conclusion. Now, what does this mean? It is Christian in his approach. He is Protestant Christian in his approach. The consequence is he needs a book to say that this is the source of somebody's faith, because he needs a book to source his faith. So he chooses to impose his own experience, his cultural religious experience, on the colonized societies, and he starts looking for, where is your book? I have a book, where is your book? So it takes two shapes. One, if you don't have a book, you may call it custom, but it is apocryphal. The written word has a huge consequence in Judeo-Abrahamic tradition. I'm making factual statements here, I'm not passing value judgments here, so be very careful in terms of drawing conclusions about the tone of what I'm saying. I'm just being factual, and the tone is extremely academic here. Judeo-Abrahamic tradition places a huge emphasis on the written word, because the revelation has been reduced to writing. Now therefore, his question is, what is not written is not based on evidence, is not supported by evidence. So which is why even today, because Indian courts have followed English traditions, we look for textual evidence even with respect to customs, without realizing that textual evidence would only be secondary codification of what existed orally. You go through the Latin American experience, you go through African experience, you go to Asian experience prior to colonization. The oral tradition was huge, which is why the focus is on Shruti. We follow Shruti. And that's no different from most of these jurisdictions, because they have all been nature-based. And most nature-based communities have a huge belief system in two aspects. One, it needs to be oral. Second, the tradition will be hugely hereditary across the board. It's not just Bharat where systems are hereditary. Two, access to that knowledge will be restricted. And there will be an elite group in most of these societies which are seen as guardians of that elite oral knowledge. And they will pass on that information from generation to generation. So when the white Christian Protestant male walks into this country, the European walks into this country, he is asking, where is your book? Now Bharat, even today, presents a conundrum to most Westerners. They can't wrap their heads around this idea. They're like, what is this country? Chaos everywhere. traffic jams are chaos, people are chaos, north and south have no connection, east and west have no connection, even within the south there is no connection, what is going on here? So when they come to this country, among the first things that you encounter from his perspective, which is clear from his documents, is absolute frustration at the amount of data points he has to deal with. He's like, this fellow is saying this is custom, that fellow is also saying this is custom. How do we codify all of this? So what do? They end up identify who according to them are the repositories of Hindu tradition. So they summon the Pandits of Kashi and they say, Batao. Now you sit and tell. So he's like, white man is asking, what do I say? Okay, this is what our Shastra says. Shastra is not a scripture, it is a knowledge tradition. There is a difference between a scripture and a knowledge tradition. Which means, it's like trying to read a bare act without understanding the principles of interpretation. Law students will understand this. If a scripture is read without the context of how it is supposed to be read and what is the manner in which it is supposed to be read, what is the training you need before you start reading it, everything will look stupid to you, or you will simply go by the literal word. Isn't there a difference between the interpretation of a bare act by someone who is legally trained and someone who is not legally trained? Of course there is. Because he sees it as a document, you see this as a legislation, which means there are principles inbuilt, from punctuations to internal aids to external aids. So what these people do around 1770s is they undertake the codification of Hindu law, and it's called Ordinance of Pandits, Anglo-Hindu law. So what we know today as codification of Hindu law or Shastric principles is actually British codification through their understanding of our scripture. William Jones and Colebrook, they decide to put it all together. Now when they're doing so, the one thing that they don't understand is what is the relationship between Shastra and Achara, which is scripture and custom or tradition. That is something that the white Christian European cannot wrap his head around because he doesn't understand the fundamental metaphysics behind this. Because the metaphysics is very different. He doesn't understand the concept of karma, he doesn't understand the concept of prarabdha, he doesn't believe in reincarnation. He has no faith in any of these things. Because there is a specific Christian parliament, to the best of my limited knowledge of Christian history, in the Roman period, where they specifically removed the assent or the endorsement to the concept of reincarnation. Until then, reincarnation was recognized even by them because they were still partly pagan Christian, because they still hadn't given up their culture prior to the conversion. Lithuania converted barely 400, 500 years ago to Christianity, so that's how recent it is. So considering that, if he doesn't understand the concept of reincarnation, none of these concepts are understood. He doesn't understand the relationship between Shastra and Achara. What is the traditional Hindu position on Shastra and Achara? I will give my limited understanding as a work in progress student of it. If I'm wrong, ignore it and pardon me for it. Most people who have some kind of understanding of Hindu philosophy will tell you that according to our calendar, this is the age of, I'm going to use an extremely politically incorrect word, and please be careful, I'm just about to drop a bombshell, be careful. Huh? This is the age of 7th Manu, sorry. This is the age of the 7th Manu, it's called, and the name of that Manu is Vaivasvata Manu. That's what you actually chant, it's Vaivasvata Manvantare is how you effectively start saying, because we believe that there are about 14 yugas, so to speak, and you'll have each Manu. So Manu is not a person, it's a position. Just as most people believe that Vyasa is not a person, Vyasa is a position of people who take over that scriptural tradition of putting a particular scripture together. So if this is the understanding, the law laid down for this particular yuga by Vaivasvata Manu is seen as the current Manu Shastra or Manusmriti for this particular era or this particular period. But the relationship is, so let's look at it this way. If the law is immutable, you don't need different Manus for different yugas. So what is the job of each Manu? Take it from me, it's going to be called a Manuvadi lecture tomorrow by people who are not even interested in understanding what I'm trying to say. The job of each Manu or a successive Manu is to identify what from the past is relevant and what is needed for the present, and put it together in the form of a Shastra for that particular Yuga. That's the job of every Manu. So what is the commentary that you're supposed to look at for this particular issue? A member of the Imperial Assembly, I think, or at least someone who was celebrated as a scholar of Hindu Shastra, Ganganath Jha or Ganganath Chattopadhyay, his commentary on Medhathiti's Manusmriti is the ruling book to understand Hindu philosophy or Manushastra or Manusmriti. Now, who is Medhatithi? Medhatithi is the son of Vaivasvata Manu. That is the understanding, because it used to be a hereditary tradition, as I said before. Now, our position is custom sometimes is capable of being at variance with Shastra. Because custom evolves. It's like this. Think of Shastra as a legislation. What moves faster, society or the law? Society. What moves faster, technology or the law? What does law do? Catch up. So it records. That is the relationship between custom and scripture. So what does scripture do? It records. But the society keeps evolving, it keeps running. So it doesn't mean that what is not directly found in the scripture or what is not directly endorsed by the scripture is unshastric. That is not the conclusion. So you will basically ask yourself, is this violative of the spirit of the Shastra? If not, even if it is not specifically endorsed by the Shastra, you will not interfere with it because it's working for the society. Don't interfere. That is the organic relationship between Shastra and Achara or custom. No, but this white Protestant Christian can't understand this. At least let's say European, I won't talk about anybody else. So he's like, okay, what do we do? These people are so dumb that they haven't even codified their own scripture. He needs our help. He needs to be reformed. So that reform is, I use the word nonsense very responsibly. The tendency to reform starts with that because the society would have reformed organically because custom is moving faster than Shastra. What did you do? You codified it and you treated this as the law. So what was meant to be left to the society through a decentralized organic evolution is then centralized through codification by the white man, and then he says, I will now judge you on the basis of this. Alright? We are moving faster than this. Why? For two reasons. One, even if the invasions hadn't happened, the society would have still evolved. But thanks to the invasions, there's a huge rupture in your own evolution which is uninterfered. And in any case, since the society never lives in isolationism, there is always bound to be some kind of interruption. Either the medieval invasions, or before that the Huns, or before that the Shakas, so on and so forth, they would come. So we found a way of keeping this Jivan Pranali going independent and regardless of these invasions through a syncretic relationship between Shastra and Achara. But this man comes and codifies, and with that two things happen, calcification and ossification of Shastric evolution. Now we are being judged on the basis of that scripture. I am not going to distance myself from the scripture. I am saying that scripture itself envisages forward organic movement, and you have not been able to wrap your heads around it. So that is the first set of principles. Now why is this relevant? Did this exercise of codification of Hindu law stop with the white Christian European? No. Our brown sahibs took it further. Because one of the things they came and said was, and this is the language used, I am not going to use any epithet or title for anyone who was involved in the constitution, because we are living in an age of re-inquiry. So, regardless of anybody's icon status, I will look at it dispassionately. What they said, they did. What they did, they did. It is for us to examine and ask ourselves whether it was right, wrong, good, bad. That's the right of every present and the God-given right of every future. So without using any epithets for anyone, without worshipping anyone, all I will say is, from 1940s, when they decided to look at Hindu law, why did this discussion start? Now I'll gradually move in the other direction. So, colonial period with respect to Hindu law, I've broadly given you a picture. I will refer to a few documents only in the interest of making sure that I don't misquote anything. But I'm going to try and engage you in a conversation as much as possible without looking at anything, just so that you understand the saransh of what I'm trying to say. So this is one track, called as the Hindu track. Then comes the Muslim track. Now, why is this important? I have demonstrated through the second book the gradual Arabization in multiple waves of the Indian Muslim identity with time, including the Wahhabi movement, which I have specifically said had its origins in a Delhi seminary. Why is this important? Until the process of Arabization is complete, or it is still work in progress, Indian Muslims continue to follow what law? With respect to succession, marriage, so on and so forth. That is the so-called period when this mythical creature called Indian Islam existed, because Muslims who were new converts or neo-converts of barely 1 or 2 generations were still living in the cultural setup of their ancestors. And therefore, Dr. Ambedkar points out during the course of the discussion on the Shariat Act and the Constituent Assembly and other places, the Maplas of North Malabar were following Hindu law. Kohat and Northwestern Frontier Province, which was 97% or maybe 92% Muslim, was following Hindu law. There was no imposition. That's because that is the law they had inherited from their ancestors, period, nothing else. So that law continues. Now, the two-nation theory picks political traction post the Khilafat movement, and the seeds for it were, according to me, sown at least 100 years before that, even before Syed Ahmad Khan, who was a product of the very same Delhi seminary where the two-nation theory actually had its origin. Now, what does this mean? If you need to unite people for the purposes of securing a separate state, you need to be able to give them a common basis. Now, the problem is, religion alone was not common or was not sufficient as a common basis, because religion and culture were fighting with each other. The Hindu ancestry and the Hindu culture of the convert Muslim and his contemporary religion or his present religion were at loggerheads with each other. So therefore, what did they have to do? The only way to create a pan-Muslim identity across the country so that the two-nation theory and specifically the Muslim League gets greater traction is by severing the relationship between the cultural past and the religious present. And to do so, you have to Shariatize Indian cultural values. Now, the British man obviously did not have any incentive in fostering unity in this country. Why would he? He was doing what we would have done in his position. Period. Are you telling me the Chanakya Niti is any different when you're actually trying to rule an enemy or any other society? It's not. Of course it is. So I am not going to look at it from the perspective of, I am just being clinical about this. He did this because he had a specific objective. Now therefore there is a very clear, I don't think the AC is functioning well enough. I think the audience is perspiring, or am I boring them to death? So the point is, he also furthers the gradual movement towards greater Arabization for multiple reasons, because there is also a strong pro-Khilafat sentiment starting from the 1990s. In fact, it's not 1919s. In the book, I established that at least from 1890s, there was active communication between the Turkish Sultan and Delhi seminaries, establishing kinship between the two. Now, therefore, here is a homegrown need to establish a separate Shariatized Muslim identity in the interest of giving Muslim League a political strength and create for it a pan-India base, a pan-India Muslim base. And you've had the Hindu movement separately. The British man then finally realizes, why don't I codify Muslim law. Until then, British Indian courts were applying Hindu customs and principles to resolve intra-Muslim disputes without any objection from members of the community. Without any objection from members of the community. Nobody revolted. Nobody took out any banners. No effigies were burnt. No stones were pelted. Okay? This is less than 100 years ago. Because the Shariat Act was passed only in 1937. Now, when that legislation is passed, British Indian courts, what would a court do when a new legislation is passed where it disavows custom and brings in a new codified law? Every custom which violates that law is out of the window. So, British Indian Muslim jurisprudence starts changing from then on, because British Indian courts are now applying principles of the Shariat as opposed to principles of Hindu law, which were previously applicable to even Muslims, without imposition. Now these are the two tracks. So until 1937 this has been established. Now what happens is, by the time you come to the 1940s, all our English trained, British trained Indian leaders who were trained in the same mold as the European master, as the colonizer, started approaching Hindu law from the very same lens as the master. And therefore, the zeal of reform. Reform. The word used was Hindu law or Hindu customs, and the Hindu society represented a slum which needed clearance. Language used by some framers of the constitution. Seeing this is that gutter that needs to be cleared. Look at this, it's so cluttered. It's like this fuzzy brain. So many wires are entangled. I need to unravel it. So the project of codification that was started by the British man in the name of Anglo-Shastric law is taken further by their Indian successors. Now whether you want to call them Indian freedom fighters or not, I leave the discussion to you entirely. Because these were the principles under which they operated. So when they take it forward, a specific committee is formulated called the Rao Committee. And what does it do? It goes across the country, seeking opinions from people. They come back saying, Arey Baba, we are actually meeting with a lot of resistance here. Because people are also saying, why do you want to codify something that is capable of running on its own? Why do you want to fixate something? Or rather, why do you want to fix something in time and cast it in stone? C-A-S-T, not C-A-S-T-E. Okay? So how do we deal with the situation? So they realize that there is extensive resistance that's coming. Now the foremost person interested in reforming the Hindu society, particularly of all its evils, were Sri Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and his law minister, who resigned subsequently in 1955 or maybe 51. Correct, 51. Incidentally, both of them supported each other in imposing restrictions under 19.2 with respect to 19.1 on free speech. They supported each other on all these things. They were no different. Now, when Sri Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru is embarking on this exercise, members of the Constituent Assembly are saying, don't do this because this is an organic flow. You don't understand this. You are too English in your headspace for you to even wrap your heads around this. You don't relate to us in any way. So the entire Legislative Assembly, or the majority of them, and members of the cabinet under Nehru were opposing him tooth and nail on the subject. Saying, why are you doing this? Then they said, okay, you want to codify because you want a secular law. Fine. Then the Hindu Mahasabha said, why do you want to only codify and reform Hindus? Let's start a uniform civil code. Because they're saying, what is this passion and zeal for reforming Hindus alone? I am quoting from them, I'll read it out, so that I stick to my word that this won't be political. And they're saying, Arey bhai, if you want to do this, you're saying all citizens are equal. Everybody is equally subject to Indian laws. Then let everybody be the subject of reform. Why just the Hindus? That was the question. Fortunately, for once, Shri Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's Law Minister Dr. Ambedkar agrees. And he says, yes, why should we not have a uniform civil code? Now here's where the discussion starts. I think around March 1947 the discussion starts, and then the change happens. So Article 44, as you know it, had two previous avatars. Hindu philosophy, so obviously it had a previous Janma also. So Article 35 and then Article 39. Now what was the fight about? Those members of the Indian Constituent Assembly who were also members of the Subcommittee on Fundamental Rights basically said, and these were people who were considered members of the political left of that period. Now just pause here for a moment. Members of the political left of that period wanted a uniform civil code. Hansa Mehta, I'll give you the names. Masani, each of these names I'll mention. And they're specifically telling members of the Subcommittee on Fundamental Rights, make uniform civil code a part of the chapter on fundamental rights so that it is justiciable. Law students know the meaning of justiciability, which means it must be enforceable through courts in a writ petition, either under 32 or 226. So they are asking for this. They are outflanked by the rest of the members of the subcommittee saying, no, don't do this. We are not ready for this. Sorry, they are not ready for this. Too early, too premature. So they say, nothing doing. From there, the discussion is, if it remains in the chapter that deals with fundamental rights, those protected, pampered rights cannot be protected. So what do? Push it to DPSC, Directive Principles of State Policy. This is how it gets pushed from the fundamental rights chapter to the DPSC chapter. Now when this discussion happens, so Uniform Civil Code has been pushed into DPSC. That means all non-Hindu cultural rights have been protected. But the ongoing reformist zeal with respect to Hindu law continues. And so this entire huge massive report, which was prepared into thousands of pages based on the Rao Committee's cogitations and deliberations across the country, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru realizes that he has massive opposition from the then President Rajendra Prasad, from Vallabhbhai Patel, everybody, the Ayers and Iyengars on the committee, Anantasayanam Iyengar, everybody saying, sorry, you can't do this, you don't understand this. Now they were not saying, remember this, they were not saying that no, Hindu widows don't have the right of remarriage. This was not their position. They were not saying that a son is more equal than the daughter. Just because somebody opposes legislative interference with the rights of one particular community doesn't mean that they are being regressive or patriarchal. That's not the conclusion that you arrive at. Because they made their positions clear. Because what are they saying? Society conditions were slightly different then. Traditional roles of man and woman continued. This is the very same assembly that subsequently keeps same-sex marriage outside the scope of the Special Marriage Act. Go ahead. Brand them homophobic. Go ahead, do it. Do that also. What are they trying to say? That for every step that the society has to take, you give it some time. So the argument that was being extended to beneficiaries of the DPSC arrangement was being extended to Hindus as well, that give us equally the time to move forward. Because Unlike others, our Shastras are not immutable, plus our Shastras are not completely binding with respect to custom and achara and what happens on the ground. Because despite English education, they understood the Vikruti that they had developed, and they were trying to say, your entire position is based on the codification undertaken of Hindu law by this colonizer who doesn't understand us. We will tell you that this is not our position. And that's the discussion that happens. And routinely each time the discussion with respect to the Hindu code was being presented, Vallabhbhai Patel, who would manage the floor of the parliament, would find a way to not have time for the Hindu code. To say, we don't have time for the discussion. Go on, keep moving. It's like Tirupati Darshanam. Jargandi. Keep moving, we don't have time. There is too much to be done here. There is too much of legislative business that this body has to attend to that we don't have time for this. Plus, one question that they asked is, what is this urge to look for so many loopholes in the majority community? I am not saying this. I'll show the language again. I'll prove everything that I've just said. That your entire approach to this community is only reform. So, according to you, there's nothing right with us. If the state chooses to make one particular community the perpetual object of its reformist zeal, what is the message that you are sending to that community? That you are this special child that constantly needs special treatment in a negative sense. That we are the ones who constantly need reform. That's what they said. I'm not saying it. So therefore, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru realizes, I can't push this whole thing lock, stock and barrel. I will have to give it in doses and I'll have to tone it down significantly. Because the committee's recommendations were not fully acceptable, so he breaks it down into 4 parts. That translates to the promulgation of the Hindu Code Bill in 4 different installments from 1955 to 61, post the resignation of his erstwhile law minister. That's how this moves forward. By which time Article 44 has become sacrosanct. That here reform will continue, there uniform civil code will be parked on the table for eternity. At least Article 370 is a temporary status. Nothing is said about Article 44, therefore it is indefinitely temporary, which makes it eternal. And therefore the argument is, since it is in the DPSC, and since the history of the parliament shows that it was moved from fundamental rights to DPSC, there is no urgency for it and there is no legislative mandate for it, or there is no constitutional mandate to undertake this particular activity. Now then what happens? Obviously the Supreme Court has interpreted Article 44 and the position with respect to DPSC in multiple judgments. So what are the judgments that you should be looking at? One line of judgments that deals with enforceability or justiciability or otherwise of directive principles of state policy and the comparison with fundamental rights. And the other is, when can a discussion on Article 44 actually start? Advice from the Supreme Court saying, let's start the ball rolling, let's get the ball rolling at least now. Subject to correction by the erudite members here and there, the broad position on DPSC today is, directive principles of state policy is a statement of vision towards which policy statement will be geared or policy formulation will be geared. Which means, even though it is not justiciable through a writ petition, each time you formulate a policy, you will try and at least inch incrementally closer to the goals set out in the directive principles of state policy. So in that sense, to put it crudely or in any other way, directive principles of state policy are perhaps the definition of a Ram Rajya, which is to say this is what we will move towards. Now if that is the case, the question that you should ask is, in light of these positions taken by the Supreme Court, where it is saying that policy formulation should be in the direction of the implementation of the DPSC, when according to some people will that blessed time come when we can actually have a proper conversation on a uniform civil code? Forget all the political shenanigans surrounding this. Ask yourself this simple question: when does the buck stop, or rather start on this conversation? What is the time period when we can actually say, now the society is ready? When will it be ready? From here, let's go to the question of what is the state's power to interfere with personal laws? Well, the state's power to interfere with personal laws already stands established because they have interfered with Hindu personal law. So I'm sure there is no question about it anymore. You can't talk about the unconstitutionality of the exercise of state power with respect to personal law because that's already done and dusted. What applies to the goose applies to the gander. So the question is, what is the constitutional justification to exempt one particular group or certain groups from the application of the very same constitutionally bestowed power to interfere with personal laws? My humble submission is, there is no constitutional justification. There are all sorts of non-constitutional justifications. Now, whether it's non-constitutional justification or unconstitutional justification, I leave it for you to decide. But this is the position. Now, the then question would be, okay, you have said UCC, UCC. Now, what are the areas that the UCC will cover? If the interference of the Indian state with Hindu personal law is to be taken as the template or an example, what did it interfere with? Polygamy, succession. Broadly, these are the two areas. Adoption to some extent, these are the areas. Well, these will be the very same areas. Naturally, the corollary will be, if interference with personal laws in the context of the majority community has translated to interference with three specific identifiable areas, that would be the very same areas for others as well. So legislative competence is beyond question. There is some track record or example for the areas in which the state can interfere. Now, here comes the balancing test. It can interfere. There is a track record. What is the constitutional question then? To what extent can you invade and interfere? That question would necessarily mean there has to be a balance between the state's interest and power to interfere with personal laws and the community's interest and fundamental right to protect its personal laws under Articles 25, 26 and 29, broadly speaking. Because cultural rights of minorities are also, not just minorities, cultural rights of any section of the population is protected by Article 29. Personal laws are part of culture, I dare argue that. I am not going to deny that. Article 25 and 26. 25 speaks of individual rights and 26 will speak of denominational or institutional rights and 29 will speak of cultural rights of a community. If all three were to be combined, your best possible cases, all three rights are put together. None of these provisions envisage a bar on the legislature's power to interfere. None of these provisions say you cannot interfere merely because there's a right. Because there are any number of instances where Hindu practices have been interfered with independent of the Hindu Code Bill, citing the very same reformist provisions under 25(2)(b) and other provisions. It speaks of for reform, for entry of depressed classes, so on and so forth. Okay? This question of balancing, it is for the state to answer. Following are the questions which I think that the legislature must seriously consider. If the state has taken a position that bigamy or polygamy disrespects the individual right of a woman. Of course, now there's a question as to what is a woman. I don't know what to say now. So, we'll be told, hey, who's a woman? What do we know? What is the definition? So phobic, what phobic? Now we don't know, all plus phobic only. So they will say this. They, huh? Okay. So the point will be that if you have taken a position in principle, what is your justification for the application of the principle to 80% of the population and the non-application of the very same principle to others? When it matters and when it is convenient, everybody is an equal citizen. When it matters and when it's inconvenient, sorry, no, we are not equal, we are more equal. Khalistan bhariye. I didn't say Khalistan, I said Khalistan. Which means Riktustan, okay, Riktustan, okay? So you can do that. So the question would be, we have been told repeatedly by the Supreme Court and Constitutional benches, including in the Sabarimala judgment, which I categorically disagree with, of 28th of September 2018, and rightly so, it's been referred to a larger bench. They've said, the majority opinion has been, if I remember it right, this was the language used quoting planetary system. Individual rights are the star in the constellation of fundamental rights of this country under the Constitution. This is the language used, because that is constitutional morality. Well, apply the very same constitutional morality with respect to the basic individual dignity of a person who is suffering the indignity of bigamy and polygamy. Do it. Difficult? Well, then constitutional morality seems to have a fluid definition. Then let's go to the next step. We have already taken the position with respect to matters of succession, equal. That is again impinging on equality and dignity. If anybody were to go through all the live hearings on the same-sex marriage, the number of lessons that we were given on individual dignity, equality, astounding. Ask them to apply the very same arguments in the context of this situation, and you will see how the position changes within a matter of seconds. Within seconds. This is not a political argument, this is an argument on principle, on matters of convenient hypocrisy. Right? Then from there you go to the next step. Okay, succession, now adoption. Each of these questions. Now I have to ask myself this question. The only way that you get to be treated as an island from the application of constitutional principles to a group is if the group or a particular mindset believes we are exceptions to everything that the Constitution says. Now whoever says as much or believes as much, I leave it to them. This is the only way that this is possible, which means exclusive treatment, exceptional treatment seems to be the response to a pro-UCC argument. I have not made a pro-UCC argument yet. All I've said is the state has already established a precedent by undertaking a reform with respect to 80% of the population. It has only two options from here on. Roll it back. I'm not saying because I want 3 more wives. All I'm saying is you have only 2 options. Roll it back or move forward. Status quo or yathasthiti does not seem to be acceptable anymore. I am not again presenting a pro-UCC or an anti-UCC position. Now, between the 2 options, what do you think the government can do or will do, because it's an Indian government? It will not roll back anything that is already done to Hindus, because that is not there in the Indian DNA at all. So it has only one option. But the second option would mean it starts fighting with that all-encompassing catch-all value of the Indian Constitution, secularism. So this is one of those instances where 3 different forms of rights will meet this Trivedi Sangam. I'll tell you what it is. Individual rights and dignity will stop here. No, you can't go here. Constitutional morality will come here and stop here. Then all rights of women, gender equality will come and stop here. Because this space is occupied by secularism. That's the void, that's the Bermuda Triangle, where everything vanishes. It is the black hole where everything goes down and nothing comes out. Now this is the broad position. I will take just 15 minutes to read out certain excerpts. I will give you the references along with the dates from the Constituent Assembly debates in the document. Go back, read. People can criticize me for the book, but so far nobody has been able to disprove the book factually. And the test is, facts come first. Opinions can take a backseat. Sentiments have no place whatsoever. Offended sentiments, bahar jao. So on the first track of the evolution of Hindu code bills, read this paper called Codified Hindu Law, Myth or Reality by Madhu Kishwar, 1994. Make a note of these documents. Then you go to this, and please note, I have referred even to those sources with whom I have an ideological difference of opinion, because if those sources have been good on facts, then I don't have a problem with it. I may disagree with the outcome or the position, but if factually it's decent, I will not disrespect that particular document. Rhetoric, Reason and Representation, 4 narratives in the Hindu Code Bill Discourse by Chitra Sinha. Then Hindu Law Committee, also known as the Rao Committee. And the discussion with respect to this happened extensively between 1948 to 1951. Read the opinion of Dwarkanath Mittar, otherwise it should have been Mitra, because Mitra was pronounced as Mittar, like Chattopadhyay became Chatterjee and Bandyopadhyay became Banerjee. So read that. His opinions with respect to how the public responded to the proposal to reform Hindu law. Then you look at the opposition, specifically positions from Vallabhbhai Patel, Rajendra Prasad, J.B. Kriplani, all these people who ranged themselves against Nehru's position with respect to Hindu Code Bill. Then you read positions of Sri Shama Prasad Mukherjee, N.C. Chatterjee, and how they suggested the Uniform Civil Code, if at all the state wanted to interfere with personal laws. And then you take a look at the positions from the Sikh community, represented by Sardar Man Singh and Sardar Hukum Singh, who basically said you can't combine. By that time, the positions had changed, my mindset had changed. They said if you want to include Sikhs in the Hindu Code Bill, we will not accept it. Then you will see, and now you will be reminded of quite a few positions that are being aired now. We are being told now by a lot of people who want to protect the rights of a particular group, before our rights, your rights will be affected first, because you have more diversity. So a lot of people have suddenly grown a special interest in protecting Hindu rights and Hindu diversity now. Here is what happened at that point. Sri Nasiruddin Ahmad from Bengal, he specifically criticized the broad application of the Mitakshara system across the country to say, this will lead to breakdown of Hindu families. This will lead to breakdown of Hindu culture and Hindu diversity. This was the argument that he wanted to present, because this response came as a reaction to Shama Prasad Mukherjee's suggestion for a uniform civil code. Then the women parliamentarians, especially Sucheta Kriplani and others, basically said that even what Nehru was proposing was half measure. It was not enough. Hansa Mehta had the very same position. Then N.C. Chatterjee said, why not frame, if you have got the courage and wisdom to do it, one uniform civil code? Why are you then proceeding with communal legislation? Now here's the fundamental question that you should ask yourself. If a uniform civil code is going to be brought about, what will it do to the existing Hindu codified legislations? That is a question even for the Hindu community to consider. Right now, at least, the Daya Bhaga and the Mitakshara systems have been broadly clubbed together and they've been made applicable. If a uniform civil code comes about, the last remaining vestige with the Hindu law in the form of a cultural application, will that go as well? That's a question that Hindus are entitled to ask. I'm batting for both sides here, or I'm batting for neither. Then, of course, so Dr. Ambedkar's position on the Hindu Code Bill, again from the very same page, the very same document of Chitra Sinha, read that. And then there's a publication called Indians Impossible Civil Code by Cambridge University Press. Seems like a prophetic title, go through it. And then I will come to the history of the Uniform Civil Code, right from the beginning as to when it was proposed and what happened. I'll just take about 5 minutes, not more than that. So the Subcommittee on Fundamental Rights was a 10-member body. It categorized all fundamental rights into justiciable rights and non-justiciable rights, which means those which are enforceable through a writ petition through constitutional courts and those which are non-enforceable. Members included B.N. Rao. Who is B.N. Rao? He was the advisor to the Constituent Assembly who prepared the first draft constitution. Effectively, I would say he is the father of the constitution, at least its original draft. K.T. Shah, Hansa Mehta, so on and so forth. And in the final report of 16th of April 1947 of the subcommittee, the UCC was placed under fundamental right, even as of 16th of April 1947 in the final report of the subcommittee on fundamental rights. The state shall endeavour to secure for citizens a uniform civil code. This was Article 39. Now then, pre-Constituent Assembly debates. Both K.M. Munshi, Kulapati Munshi, and the one unsung hero of contributions to the Constitution in the Constituent Assembly is K.M. Munshi, the founder of Bharati Vidya Bhavan. You should read more on him. Astounding contribution to Bharatiya culture and to Indian Constitution. In fact, his positions on sedition in the Constituent Assembly are worth reading, because he was one of the foremost people to say we must have a provision which penalizes sedition, because we are coming in the immediate backdrop of the partition. That was his position. Both Munshi's and Ambedkar's draft articles of March 1947. So both Dr. Ambedkar and Munshi wanted a uniform civil code to be contained in fundamental rights. Then, while discussing what from Mr. K. Munshi's proposed draft shall form part of the enforceable part of fundamental rights, Mr. M.R. Masani, one of the members of the subcommittee, proposed that a provision relating to the common civil code be made. It was decided, now please note, it was decided by a majority that this was outside the scope of fundamental rights. The minority, which means those who wanted to keep this as part of fundamental rights, consisted of Mr. Masani, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, Hansa Mehta, and Dr. Ambedkar. You can't cite Dr. Ambedkar on all sorts of issues and then not cite him when it comes to uniform civil code. No, that's mighty convenient. Then, by 30th of March, the subcommittee had decided to make the uniform civil code a part of the principles of directive principles of state policy. This is the position that goes on. What I will do is that I will share this broad table with the organizers, because I don't see the point in hoarding this. I will give credit to my researchers who have worked with me on the subject, Ms. Shaktiki Sharma and Ms. Avni Mishra, both of whom are part of my core constitution research team, and as well as Ms. Shaktiki Sharma has contributed extensively to the research on both the books. They've put this all together because we have been waiting to present this material for years now in preparation for what was supposed to be the one book, which has become a tetralogy right now. So here is the position of Naziruddin Ahmad, who again says that as far as we are concerned, the Shariat is immutable, it's not even man-made, it's God-made, you can't interfere. To which Dr. Ambedkar basically responds by saying, Bhai Sahab, ये तो 1937 में आया, ये कहाँ से इम्यूटेबल हो गया? थोड़ा अपनी क्रोनोलॉजी को तो ठीक कर लीजिए. To quote a popular meme. So Dr. Ambedkar says, coming to the amendments, so what is this amendment from fundamental rights to directive principles of state policy? Because those amendments were proposed by the Muslim members of the Constituent Assembly, saying no, it can't be part of fundamental rights. Coming to the amendments, there are only two observations which I would make. This is by Shri B.R. Ambedkar. My first observation would be to state that members who put forth these amendments say that Muslim personal law, so far as this country was concerned, was immutable and uniform throughout the whole of India. He's saying this is your argument. I think most of my friends who have spoken on this amendment have quite forgotten that up to 1935, the Northwest Frontier Province was not subject to Shariat law. Now, why is Dr. Ambedkar referring to Northwest Frontier Province as opposed to any other province? Because that was the Muslim majority province. Near majority, complete majority, and after the cohort exodus of Hindus and the riots there, it had become almost 97% Muslim, I'm so sorry. It followed, so here's what he continues, it followed the Hindu law in matters of succession and in other matters, so much so that it was in 1939 that the central legislature had to come into the field to abrogate the application of Hindu law to the Muslims of the Northwest Frontier Province, and to apply the Shariat to them. He says that is not all. Here's the second observation. My second observation is to give them an assurance. I quite realize their feelings in the matter, but I think they have read too much into Article 35, which merely proposes that the state shall endeavor to secure a civil code for citizens of the country. For a moment, allow me to pause here. The language of the provision on Uniform Civil Code, whether it is under DPSC or under fundamental rights, either as Article 44 or 39, was always saying the state shall endeavor. So it had a more participatory quality. It was not a mandate that you will do this. It shall endeavor to do this. Now therefore, those people who are against the UCC saying, it does not say you shall promulgate a UCC, it says you shall endeavor to. Therefore, you don't even have the very same constitutional competence as you would have had it said shall promulgate a UCC. You see, this is the lawyer at play. Shall endeavor is different from shall promulgate. But for a moment, look at it slightly differently. Even when it was part of fundamental rights, understanding the sensitivity of the issue, the framers of the Constitution only used the word shall endeavor. Even for that language, they had a problem because they did not want the state to have any kind of power to step into the territory of Sharia. Which is to say, a state which is not Sharia compliant cannot interfere with the territory of Sharia in any manner. I have not said this, this is their statement. They have said this as much on the floor of the Constituent Assembly. I don't even need to paraphrase to say this. I don't need to invent or fabricate anything to say this. It does not say, so therefore Dr. Ambedkar is saying, I understand your feelings, but you're reading too much into Article 35 because the provision merely proposes that the state shall endeavor to secure a civil code for the citizens of the country. It does not say that after the code is framed, the state shall enforce it upon citizens merely because they are citizens. It is perfectly possible that the future parliament may make a provision by way of making a beginning that the code shall apply only to those who make a declaration that they are prepared to be bound by it. Now you see where this optional option comes from. Where even Dr. Ambedkar says, at least let's start in that direction. Those who wish to break from the fold and embrace the secular code of this country, let them have the power to do so. Now juxtapose this in a slightly different context. Those who don't want to be married under the Hindu Marriage Act or the Muslim Marriage Act can marry under what? So you have the option of doing that. Why shouldn't you have a similar option in the context of application of personal laws? Because that means those people who have been held tight should not be given even one option to break free, because that would loosen the bonds. That is the fear here. So even an optional position where the UCC is made optional was not acceptable. So this is broadly the sum and substance of it. You can read this until the cows home, pun intended. But these are the issues, and this is the broad history. Now what you choose to make of the debate surrounding the UCC, independent of the political noise being made around it, is for you to decide as free, hopefully thinking citizens of Bharat. Thank you.